The year was 1941, and the Soviet Union was dying. Not retreating, not regrouping, not buying time for a counteroffensive. Dying. In the first weeks after Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, the most massive military invasion in the history of human warfare, the Red Army had collapsed in ways that defied comprehension. Entire armies had been encircled and destroyed. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers had been captured in the opening days alone. The defensive lines that Soviet military planners had spent years constructing had been penetrated, bypassed, and rendered irrelevant within hours. Generals who had commanded divisions and corps found themselves with nothing left to command because their formations had ceased to exist. And at the center of this catastrophe, in his office in the Kremlin, sat Joseph Stalin, a man who had spent the previous 3 years systematically destroying the officer corps of his own military, who had executed marshals, generals, colonels, and captains by the thousands on suspicion of disloyalty, who had replaced professional military judgment with political reliability as the primary qualification for command, and who was now watching the consequences of those decisions unfold on a scale that even his considerable capacity for denial could not fully absorb.
Stalin was not a man who accepted responsibility. In his understanding of the world, failures happened because people around him had failed him, betrayed him, lacked the will or the loyalty to execute his vision. He had spent his entire career in power finding people to blame for things that went wrong, and the machinery he had built for locating and punishing those people was the most sophisticated and comprehensive instrument of state terror the modern world had yet produced. What he needed right now, in the summer of 1941, with German forces advancing toward Moscow at a rate that no one had thought possible, was someone to blame for the disaster. And there was an obvious candidate. His name was Georgy Konstantinovich Zhukov. He was the chief of the General Staff of the Red Army. He was, by almost any technical measure, the most capable military officer the Soviet Union possessed. He had won the only clear Soviet military victory of the preceding years at Khalkhin Gol, where he had used combined arms warfare to destroy a Japanese army in a manner so decisive that Japan never seriously threatened the Soviet eastern border again. He was brilliant, methodical, physically fearless, and possessed of a clarity of military thinking that cut through the political noise of the Soviet system with an efficiency that made him simultaneously indispensable and dangerous.
He was also the man who had been responsible for Soviet defensive preparations when the Germans came across the border. In the Soviet system, that fact alone was potentially a death sentence. Stalin had already arrested generals for less, had already shot men for failures that were, at their core, failures of Stalin's own making. The purges of the late 1930s had established a clear and unambiguous principle in Soviet military culture. When something went wrong, someone would be held responsible, and the person held responsible would not survive the experience. Zhukov knew this. Every Soviet officer knew this. It was the foundational reality of military service in the Red Army. You served in the shadow of the possibility that Stalin might one day turn his attention to you, and when that day came, the quality of your service would be far less important than the quality of your ability to navigate what followed. And now, the German army was 40 miles from the Soviet border and advancing at 40 miles a day, and Zhukov was the chief of the general staff, and Stalin was looking for someone to explain what had gone wrong. The meeting happened in the Kremlin. These meetings always happened in the Kremlin, in Stalin's office, at hours that Stalin chose, in conditions that Stalin controlled. The room itself was an instrument of psychological pressure. Stalin moved around it while others stood. He was shorter than most people expected and quieter than most people expected, and both of these qualities made him more threatening rather than less, because the men who stood in that room understood that the stillness and the quiet were the stillness and quiet of something that could destroy them without effort or remorse.
Present in the room that day were members of the Politburo, senior military officers, and the apparatus of the Soviet state security system, whose representatives at these meetings served as a constant reminder of what happened to people who gave unsatisfactory answers. Stalin began by laying out the situation in the terms he chose to use, which were terms that assigned responsibility for the disaster to the military leadership. He spoke about failures of preparation, failures of intelligence, failures of command. He spoke with the controlled anger of a man who had decided on the conclusion before the conversation began and was working backward from that conclusion to the evidence that supported it. Then he turned to Zhukov and asked him directly to explain how it had happened, how the German army had crossed the border and destroyed the forward Soviet defenses in a matter of hours, how the formations that were supposed to hold them had collapsed, how the military leadership of the most powerful land army in the world had apparently failed to prepare for the possibility that Germany might attack. The room was silent in the particular way that rooms in Stalin's presence were silent. Not the silence of people waiting for information, but the silence of people acutely aware of what silence was safer than speaking.
Zhukov spoke. What he said in that room on that day was something that almost no one in the Soviet system ever said to Stalin. It was something that the entire architecture of Stalinist power had been constructed to prevent anyone from saying. It required a quality of personal courage that had nothing to do with battlefield bravery and everything to do with something rarer and more difficult. He told Stalin the truth. Not a careful, managed version of the truth designed to protect himself. Not the truth with the most dangerous parts removed and the blame redistributed towards safer targets. The actual truth, clearly stated, about what had happened and why. He said that the Red Army had been unprepared because the decisions that had led to that unpreparedness had been made at the highest levels of Soviet leadership. He said that the purges of the officer corps had destroyed the institutional knowledge and professional competence that a modern military required to function. He said that the intelligence about German intentions had been available and had been ignored because the system had made it dangerous to tell Stalin things that contradicted his assumptions. He said that the doctrine, the positioning, the command structure, and the preparation of the Red Army had all been built around political considerations that had systematically undermined military effectiveness.
He said that the Germans had not defeated the Red Army through superior numbers or superior equipment. They had defeated it because the Red Army had been systematically dismantled by the people responsible for its leadership before the war had even begun. And then, in a moment that the people present in that room described afterward as the most extraordinary thing they had ever witnessed inside the Kremlin, Zhukov looked at Stalin directly and told him that the responsibility for what had happened did not rest with the officers who had tried to defend impossible positions with inadequate preparation. It rested with the leadership that had created those conditions. The room stopped breathing. Stalin looked at Zhukov for a long moment without speaking. The expression on his face was the expression of a man recalibrating. He had walked into this meeting with an understanding of how it was going to proceed, and the man in front of him had declined to proceed in that way. This happened so rarely in Stalin's experience that it required a genuine moment of adjustment. Then Stalin said what he said to men who challenged him in that room. He said it quietly, which was always more frightening than when he said things loudly. He said that what Zhukov was suggesting carried serious implications. He said that men who made the kind of accusations that Zhukov was making about Soviet leadership needed to be very certain of what they were saying and very prepared for the consequences of saying it.
He let that statement exist in the room for a moment.
Everyone present understood what he meant. Several of them had watched other men receive similar statements and then disappear from Soviet life with a completeness that made disappearance seem like the wrong word for what had happened to them. Zhukov did not change his expression. He did not qualify what he had said. He did not introduce suddenly remembered uncertainties or suggest that perhaps he had spoken hastily or request the opportunity to reconsider his position. He said that he was certain. He said that he had said what he believed to be accurate and that he was prepared to defend every element of it with documentation and evidence. He said that he understood what he was risking and that he had calculated that risk before he spoke and had spoken anyway, because the alternative was to tell Stalin something that was not true. And telling Stalin something that was not true about the military situation would produce decisions that would make the military situation worse, and the military situation was already at the threshold of catastrophe. He said, in terms that were as direct as anything that had been said in that room in years, that Stalin could have him arrested if he chose. That was Stalin's prerogative, and Zhukov was not going to pretend otherwise. But he said that arresting him would not change the facts he had described, and that the Soviet Union was going to need men who understood those facts and were willing to act on them if it was going to survive the next 6 months. Silence. Stalin moved to the window, which he did when he was thinking, and which everyone in the room recognized as a moment of genuine deliberation rather than theater. He stood there for what witnesses described as an uncomfortably long time. Then he turned back. What happened in that meeting was not what the architecture of Soviet power suggested should happen. Stalin did not have Zhukov arrested. He did not have him shot. He did not refer him to the security services for further examination. He did not even remove him from command, which would have been the minimally expected response to an officer who had just told the General Secretary of the Communist Party that the catastrophic failures of the Red Army were substantially his fault. Instead, he asked Zhukov what needed to be done. Not as a capitulation. Stalin never capitulated. But as the question of a man who had been told something he already, at some level, knew was true, by someone who had demonstrated the particular quality of character that Stalin, despite everything, found it difficult not to respect. Because Stalin had surrounded himself his entire career with men who told him what he wanted to hear, and those men had produced the situation he was currently standing inside. And the man in front of him had just told him something he did not want to hear, at considerable personal risk, which meant it was probably true, which meant it was probably useful, which meant it was probably the thing he needed to listen to. Zhukov told him what needed to be done. He spoke for a long time about reforming the command structure, about restoring professional military authority to officers who understood combined arms warfare, about the defensive lines that needed to be established and the formations that needed to be reconstituted and the doctrine that needed to be revised before the Red Army could stop the German advance, let alone reverse it. He spoke with the clarity of a man who had been thinking about these problems for a long time and had finally been given the extraordinary, improbable opportunity to say what he actually thought in a room where it might actually matter. Stalin listened to all of it. He asked questions, which was unusual. Not the rhetorical questions he used to intimidate, but actual questions. The questions of a man trying to understand something he did not fully understand. The two of them, the dictator and the general, the man who had nearly destroyed the Soviet military and the man who was going to have to rebuild it, worked through the situation in that room for hours. What came out of that meeting over the weeks and months that followed was something that had seemed impossible in June of 1941. The Red Army began to reconstitute itself. Professional officers who had been sidelined or imprisoned during the purges were brought back. Command authority was returned to military professionals rather than political commissars. The doctrine that had been built around political considerations rather than military effectiveness was replaced with doctrine that Zhukov and officers like him had developed from actual experience of actual warfare.
None of it happened quickly. None of it happened without cost that was almost incomprehensible in its scale.
The Soviet Union lost more men in the first 6 months of the war than any other nation had lost in the entire conflict. The retreat continued. Cities fell. The siege of Leningrad began. German forces reached the outskirts of Moscow. And Zhukov was there. At Moscow, at the moment when the German advance finally stopped and the first Soviet counteroffensive began, it was Zhukov who commanded. At Stalingrad, the operation that encircled and destroyed an entire German army in the most decisive single engagement of the European war, it was Zhukov who coordinated. At Kursk, at the tank battle that effectively ended German offensive capability on the Eastern Front, it was Zhukov. And at Berlin, at the final assault on the German capital in the spring of 1945, it was Zhukov who led the forces that ended the war in Europe. He survived. In a system that consumed generals at a rate that defied comprehension, where being on the wrong side of Stalin's attention meant arrest and execution and erasure from the historical record, Zhukov survived. Not by becoming what Stalin wanted him to be, not by learning to tell Stalin what he wanted to hear. He survived by being too necessary to lose, and by establishing in that meeting, on that terrible summer day in 1941, something that almost no one else in the Soviet system had ever established with Stalin.
A record of honesty that could be trusted. Stalin worked with many people. He trusted almost none of them. The men he trusted most were not the men who agreed with him most enthusiastically, because he understood, with the thoroughness of a man who had built his entire career on manipulating people, that enthusiastic agreement was usually performance rather than belief. The men he trusted, to the limited degree that Stalin trusted anyone, were the men who had demonstrated that they would tell him the truth, even when the truth was dangerous, because those men were genuinely useful rather than merely loyal. Zhukov had demonstrated it in the most direct way possible. He had stood in the room where men went to disappear and told Stalin that Stalin was responsible for the disaster he was asking about. And he had done it not as an act of political maneuvering or career calculation, because there was no reasonable career calculation that ended with that decision. He had done it because the situation required it, and because he was the only person in that room who was willing to do it. The men who were not willing to do it, the men who performed their loyalty and agreed with everything and shaped their responses around what they thought Stalin wanted to hear, those men produced the conditions that created June 1941. They produced the intelligence failures and the command collapses and the positioning decisions that had nothing to do with military effectiveness and everything to do with political safety. They produced, through years of accumulated yeses, a military machine that could not do what it existed to do.
Zhukov understood this. He had understood it before he walked into that room, which is why he was willing to say what he said. The cost of honesty in that moment was potentially his life. The cost of dishonesty was the Soviet Union. He made the calculation and said the thing and stood behind it when Stalin gave him the opportunity to retreat from it. And the Soviet Union survived. There is a version of this story that is about courage, and it is that. Standing in Stalin's office and telling Stalin that Stalin was wrong required a quality of personal fortitude that is genuinely difficult to overstate. The men who had not done it had not failed because they were cowards in the ordinary sense. They had made rational calculations about their survival in a system that made honesty dangerous and agreement safe, and they had chosen safety, which was what rational people did. Zhukov made the other choice. But the deeper truth about what happened in that room is not just about courage. It is about what honesty actually does in a crisis. When everything is falling apart, when the systems and assumptions that were supposed to prevent the catastrophe have failed, and the catastrophe is happening anyway, the only thing that can begin to address it is an accurate account of what has actually gone wrong. Zhukov gave Stalin the actual account. In doing so, he gave him the only thing that could have produced a different outcome. The truth was not comfortable. The truth implicated Stalin directly in the disaster he was trying to understand.
The truth required Stalin to accept a version of reality that contradicted the version he had been living inside for years. But the truth was the only thing that was going to help, and Zhukov knew it, and he said it, and in saying it, he changed what happened next. The war lasted 4 more years. Tens of millions of people died. What the Soviet Union endured between 1941 and 1945 was a level of destruction that is still difficult to fully comprehend. None of that was erased by what happened in one room on one day in the Kremlin. But in that room, on that day, when a man told a dictator the truth that the dictator needed to hear, and stood behind it when the dictator gave him the chance to retreat, something shifted. Not immediately, not dramatically, but in the way that actual changes happen, slowly, through the accumulation of decisions made differently, because one conversation had established what the situation actually was.
Zhukov never stopped being who he was. Difficult, uncompromising, demanding, and absolutely clear about what he believed. Stalin never stopped being Stalin. The relationship between them was never easy, and was never safe, and was never anything other than the relationship between a man who held all the power and a man who had decided that saying true things was worth more than the safety of saying false ones. But the Soviet Union fought its way back from the edge of extinction. Zhukov commanded the armies that did it. And it began, in some fundamental way, in the moment he looked at the most dangerous man in the world and told him something he did not want to hear, and refused, when given every reason to back down, to back down. That was what Zhukov said when Stalin threatened to execute him. And it turned out to be enough.